It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Mircea Dumitru, one of Romania's most distinguished philosophers and public intellectuals. His work has had a profound impact on contemporary philosophy, particularly in the areas of philosophy of language, logic, and philosophy of mind. Beyond his scholarly contributions, he has played a major role in shaping Romania's education and research activities through his leadership as rector at the University of Bucharest, a member and vice president of the Romanian Academy, and through his role as Minister of Education and Research. Throughout his career, Professor Dumitru has been a strong advocate for intellectual openness and rigorous scholarship and dialogue across disciplines. His contributions have been recognized with numerous national and international honors. We're delighted to have him with us here, and we're looking forward to his lecture entitled, "Can We Understand Consciousness, and if at all, how?"
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, for having me. Sorry for not being able to attend in person this very important conference. And thank you for inviting me back again, because I was there giving a lecture some 4 years ago in an international conference. Let me ask you if you see my slides.
Yes, we see.
Everything is okay. Okay, then we can proceed. Let me start on a very general note. Even though prima facie people could consider that these very abstract and complex topics like explaining consciousness, explaining whatever, freedom, determinism, are by their very nature philosophical, metaphysical questions. Nowadays, this became explaining awareness or subjective phenomenal consciousness became one of the hottest topics in science, and many physicists, computer scientists, mathematicians, you name them, went very hard to understand what consciousness is about, particularly so nowadays when AI became so strong, so powerful, and we need to understand how human intelligence, in particular how human consciousness work and maybe it could be replicated. So let me just give you my own take on this subject, making a short review and proposing some hints to how we can proceed further in order to understand better human consciousness. So explaining awareness, this is how actually we are going to understand phenomenal consciousness, human awareness, being aware of something which is subjective. Explaining awareness may very well be the scientific and philosophical problem of our age, the last frontier of knowledge, as it were. However, this is an extremely difficult task, because any attempt to find a proper place for consciousness within the natural world turned out so far to be not at all trivial. Why so? Because we are facing a fundamental dilemma here. There is a conceptual tension which makes this task of giving a unitary explanation to the mind and to the physical world one of the most persistent and intriguing enigma. The predominant outlook, maybe the only outlook nowadays about the natural world, is of a physical kind. However, the mind, and especially the conscious subjective experience, the awareness, do not seem to fit within this naturalist and physicalist explanation very well. So it appears that we are indeed caught in a sort of dilemma. For we either stick to a physicalist explanation, but then it seems that we have to leave out consciousness from our general outlook of the world, or else we should figure out a dramatic change of our conception about the natural world, which of course is extremely improbable, maybe impossible. But then, is any attempt at understanding consciousness a dead end, something which is doomed to fail? Now, even raising the issue of explaining consciousness in a sort of neutral way, which does not beg the question for or against the main contenders in the metaphysics of mind, is not easy at all. Because to begin with, one may question the very soundness of drawing the alleged distinction between what psychologists are calling the easy problems of consciousness, such as the ability to discriminate and integrate stimuli, to report information, to monitor internal states, or to control behavior, and on the other hand, the hard problem of consciousness, namely the problem of why do we have subjective experience, or why, in Thomas Nagel's, the famous American contemporary philosopher, phrase, there is something it is like to be in a conscious state. Now, people who resist the view that there is a genuine distinction to be drawn here have at least two kinds of answer. First, following the late Wittgenstein, they can argue that the unbridgeable gulf between consciousness and brain processes is only an illusion, because the mystery, this is how Wittgenstein puts it, the mystery of subjective experience is the outcome of our own mystification. For we are those who project certain misunderstandings of the conceptual or grammatical articulations of our language onto reality. And consequently, we find that reality mysterious and unintelligible. And this is why Wittgenstein recommended to have a sort of philosophical therapy through analyzing the language. Provided we understand how language works, we are going to dissolve many so-called metaphysical problems. And consciousness is one of those problems. The second solution is the one in which people feel that what prima facie looks like an intractable problem, this problem of explaining consciousness, within the received computationalist paradigm, which is the prevalent paradigm today to explain mind and all the products of mind in a computational way. So this will eventually find a solution. And that solution will come along the same lines that other distinctive dimensions of the mental, such as rationality, intentionality, did come along. After all, when the project of naturalizing the mind, which by and large is the materialist project or physicalist project in science and philosophy, which roughly means the attempt to show how mental phenomena can be explained or maybe explained away in physical, non-mental terms, seems so promising. Why not be optimistic about the prospects of explaining the subjectivity of the phenomenal consciousness using the same pattern of explanation, this kind of materialist pattern that is used so successfully when rationality and intentionality are at stake? So the appeal of materialism consists in the fact that intelligent human behavior and many other aspects of the mind could be, and actually they were explained within materialist outlook and framework. Now, the hope here is that structures and functions of the brain will provide an appropriate causal explanation for consciousness in the very same way that they actually did for rationality and intentionality. To be more specific, in the case of the easy problems, what one looks for is an explanation for certain behavioral and cognitive functions. The required explanation proceeds via the causal role that a certain structure or mechanism plays in the cognitive system. And there is compelling evidence that computational mechanisms instantiated by neural structures fit the overall causal nexus within which brain and mind are integrated. And this is why many people believe now that with AI, we are going to solve all the mysteries of the mind, because by and large, AI is something which is computational, regardless what are the nitty-gritty details of how we compute the symbols, the language. So what makes materialism a very attractive position in current metaphysics of mind is precisely this causal story that it tells us about how intelligent human behavior is produced by physical structures through the causal roles that they play within our cognitive economy. But now, is there any compelling evidence that the same explanatory materialist strategy will do with respect to the properties of phenomenal consciousness? Against the background provided by the current science of the mind, is it reasonable, after all, to embrace this optimistic view that the same materialist causal explanation will provide eventually the resources needed to place consciousness within the physical order of things? Now, here it is a diagnosis of the current state of philosophy of mind offered by an important and very influential contemporary American epistemologist, Lawrence Bonjour. And I give you the following quote from Bonjour, and you have a part of the quote on the slide. Recent philosophy of mind has been dominated by materialist or physicalist views. Views that hold that mental states are entirely material or physical in nature, and correlatively that a complete account of the world, one that leaves nothing out, can be given in entirely materialist terms. Though this may be changing to some extent, philosophers of mind who are willing to take seriously the possibility that materialism might be false are still quite rare. End of quote. And this is from his 2010 book Against Materialism. Now, we can hear lately dissenting voices when this issue is at stake. And these voices are growing nowadays, let me tell you that. For the advocates of dualist solutions along the lines of René Descartes' philosophy of mind, to this problem of phenomenal consciousness will answer in the negative to the question raised before. The rationale is that explaining intelligent behavior and cognitive functions will not do in general as a solution to the issue of why, when we perform a cognitive function, we subjectively experience certain qualitative states which have a phenomenal character, with phenomenal properties also known in philosophical jargon as qualia. It's a Latin medieval term that we use in order to stress upon the content of our experience now and here. The feeling of smelling, let's say, a rose, or the feeling of hearing the pitch of a violin, or the feeling of having some other emotions, and so on and so forth. And the content of this experience, the contents are called qualia. This is
Mircea, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you mind actually going to increase your screen? Just go to the screen view just to make it into a presentation so that it fits the screen.
Sorry, could you say it again, because I couldn't.
Yes,
couldn't
if you,
what you said.
if you can go either at the top which says yeah, just to increase your screen basically occupies a small part of our screen. So if you go to
Okay.
the screen, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. Shall I go over something that I already said in order to make my presentation
No, I think
clear to you, or was it okay until?
Right.
Okay, I can continue then, right?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. Okay, so I was saying about those qualia that are the contents of our subjective experience. So why, after all, the performance of those functions is accompanied by a subjective experience and does not take place, as it were, blindly or in the dark. And actually, there are some other functions of our bodies which are going in the dark. We don't know now the level of the insulin in our blood. We may know that we feel hungry, but we don't know what is the precise level of the sugar in the blood. Now, here it is again, bonjour, challenging materialism. I have always found the situation extremely puzzling. As far as I can see, materialism is a view that has no very compelling argument in its favor, and that is confronted with the very powerful objections to which nothing even approaching an adequate response has been offered. The central question, elaborated in various ways, is that the main materialist view, quite possibly the only serious materialist view, offers no account at all of consciousness and seems incapable in principle of doing so. But consciousness, as Nagel pointed out long ago, is the central feature of mental states, or at least the very, or at the very least a feature central enough to make a view that cannot account for it plainly inadequate. End of quote. Now, even writers who are not self-avowed dualists acknowledge the peculiarity of consciousness. Thus, another American contemporary philosopher, Joseph Levine, in his book, Purple Haze, The Puzzle of Consciousness, from 2001, articulates and defends a reductionist materialist story about mind, but nevertheless, he emphatically says that, and I quote, if mentality were exhausted by rationality and intentionality, I don't think the mind-body problem would be so pressing. Sure, we don't completely understand how either rational inference or intentionality arises in nature. And it may turn out that we never will. But at the moment, there is no reason for deep-seated pessimism. The explanatory mechanisms we have available, formal processes with nomic information relations, might do the job. We have at least a clue how something made out of what we're made out of could possibly support these features of mental life. But when it comes to consciousness, I maintain we are clueless. End of quote. Now, the issue of dualism, the Cartesian position in ontology that there is this substance out there which has mechanical properties, physical properties, chemical properties, and so on and so forth. And as opposed to that is the mental substance. This is how Descartes puts it, which has the property of being logical, of being coherent, of having this intentionality relation with the objects, with the world. So this issue of dualism has been brought to the forefront of the consciousness studies lately because of a group of 3 epistemic arguments which are directed against the materialist explanation of consciousness. And more specifically, there is the so-called explanation argument, then the knowledge argument, and last but not least, the modal or conceivability argument. So let me just give you in a very short and condensed form those 3 arguments which are in the forefront of the discussion of the metaphysics of mind today. Let me start with the explanatory argument, which goes roughly like this. We have physical accounts which explain spatio-temporal structures, functions, and causal roles in producing a system's behavior. But then there is this explanatory gap because explaining structures and function does not suffice to explain phenomenal consciousness. Therefore, no physical count, as of yet, or maybe in principle, can fully explain consciousness. The knowledge argument is very well known because it was introduced by this Australian philosopher way back in 1986, Frank Jackson. He introduced the arguments through this kind of thought experiment. Thought experiments are part of the methodology of contemporary analytic philosophy. We in philosophy cannot do, of course, real experiments, but we can experience and we can make experiments with some scenarios, and we build up scenarios in order to test our intuitions to the limit. And this is the story in the thought experiment that Frank Jackson tells us about this woman, Mary, who is a neuroscientist who knows everything about the physical processes of color vision, yet she has lived her entire life, and this is part of the thought experiment, her entire life in a black and white room and has never seen red, let's say. Now, when Mary finally sees red, when she goes out in the real world, she learns arguably something new, what it is like to see red. And this truth was not deducible from her complete physical knowledge, suggesting that knowledge of physical facts does not entail necessarily knowledge about consciousness. We can discuss about this because people could have various intuitions about this, but if you try for yourself to give an answer to this kind of, let's say, question, and let me just modulate a bit my example. Instead of colors, let's say we take the example of sounds. You know everything about acoustics in physics, and you never heard the pitch of the bassoon, let's say, okay, or the viola. When you hear for the first time the sound which is produced by a bassoon or by a viola or by a violin, it appears that you find out something new about that world, which is related to your awareness, subjective experience. Therefore, knowing the physics, the complete physics about sounds is not enough, does not suffice in order to infer or to know everything about the phenomenal world. Now, the last argument, which is extremely intriguing, is the argument that was produced by this Australian philosopher, David Chalmers, who was the originator of the whole discussion back in 1990s, when he pointed out that functionalism in philosophy of mind is not enough to understand consciousness. He wrote a book, The Conscious Mind, published by Oxford University Press in 1996, in which he gave the whole story that philosophers knew about functionalism, about materialism, and he also pointed out that this is not enough to understand the consciousness and subjectivity. Okay, so the last argument in this group of three epistemic arguments is this conceivability argument, okay? And here it is how it goes. Now, consciousness is non-physical because it is at least conceivable that there might be zombies which are duplicates of ourselves. Philosophical zombies are not the holy zombies, are the philosophically postulated entities which are our duplicates, which function precisely as we function in all those physical, chemical, biological features that we have, except for the fact that they are not aware, they are not conscious about their experience. So if it is at least conceivable that there could exist zombies, then it is possible that there are zombies. If conceivably, if we can conceive that something exists which is like a philosophical zombie, then it is possible that there be zombies. And if it is metaphysically possible that there be zombies, then consciousness is not physical. Now, a more abstract form of this argument will make explicit this anti-materialist substance of the conceivability argument. And incidentally, this shows that a common thread of all views in the metaphysics of mind, okay, this neo-Cartesian pattern is the following. There is an epistemic gap, which is that physical truths don't entail phenomenal truths. Then this gap could be underwritten by an ontological gap. Since there is a gap in our knowledge, then there should be a gap in distinct domains of physical and phenomenal worlds. And therefore, materialism is false because materialism states that there is a necessary connection between this phenomenology and the ontology. And this is a common pattern that unifies all three arguments. Okay. Now, this common pattern of neo-Cartesian arguments nicely brings out the dialectics which is going on here. For the reactions of materialists against this form of dualism can be read off from this pattern. Thus, one form of materialism, which is type A materialism, rejects premise one. So they reject that there is an epistemic gap in our knowledge. But another type, which is more interesting to me, is this type B materialism, which endorses the first premise but denies the second premise. So it denies that there is a distinction in ontology between experience and physical world. Now, type B materialism is instructive for our discussion here because it collides head-on with the form of dualism advocated by the conceivability argument. What this form of materialism rejects is that epistemic failure entails ontological failure. And according to this form of materialism, there is indeed an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal domains, but that gap is not underwritten by a corresponding ontological gap. Hence, conceivability does not entail possibility. In other words, even if the two realms do not connect via conceiving or knowing or explaining, it doesn't follow that there is no ontological connections between the two domains. Hence, even if a zombie world is conceivable, it is not, however, metaphysically possible. Now, going back to our three arguments, what all this means is that we can conceive zombies, but that is not sufficient for them to be metaphysically possible. Or, going back to the knowledge argument, Mary does not know some truths while she's in her room, but those truths concern all along some basic physical facts. And when Mary gets out of her room, she comes to know the same facts under different guises. So type B materialism even acknowledges the distinction between the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. However, there is no ontological gap underlying the epistemic gap between the two domains. And the prospects then, the optimistic projects for physicalists or materialists, that eventually we are going to have a unified whole science of this unitary ontology, regardless the limits that we now have in our knowledge. Okay. How many minutes do I still have?
45.
Sorry?
15 minutes.
15 minutes altogether with discussions?
No, without discussion.
Without discussion. Okay, then I'm good. Now, what is the kind of relation which holds between matter and mind according to this type of materialism? So most forms of type B materialism spell out the relation in terms of identity between phenomenal states and physical states or functional states. There is a powerful kind of argument which can be used to back the identity relation involved in this central and control of type B materialism. And what I mean by these are statements used to express theoretical identifications of the kind water is H2O or gold is the element with atomic number 79. Some very prominent American philosophers, such as Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam, have argued that these are cases of identities which are not known a priori or derived through conceptual analysis. We have to discover them empirically and theoretically. And so they are empirical identities, but they are nevertheless metaphysically necessary. Type B materialists hold that identities of the very same kind obtain between phenomenal concepts and physical or functional concepts. So in the end of the day, we are going to discover this kind of identity between what is going on in our brain and the mental or psychological phenomena that are causally linked to what is going on in our brain. However, this kind of move that type B materialists are making is ironical because Saul Kripke himself explicitly rejected this kind of view. I'll come back to this in a moment, but let me tell you more about this kind of materialism. Type B materialists will say that what Kripke holds about theoretic identifications, like water is H2O, applies equally well to the relation between consciousness or phenomenal concepts on the one hand, and physical or functional concepts on the other hand, which is that we may discover, in the end of the day, empirically, that the two distinct concepts refer to the same thing in nature. And those truths are a posteriori, because we found out the truth empirically, but nevertheless necessary. There is a necessary connection between the neurochemical activity in our brains and those psychological phenomena associated with awareness. Now, indeed, this is a superb move on behalf of the type B materialists, which is meant to conciliate this epistemic gap between the two domains. For since we discover empirically that phenomenal and physical concepts co-refer, there is nothing within the repertoire of our own knowledge which entitles us to infer a priori possibility from conceivability, while ruling out the ontological gap. Deep down, the thing to which both concepts refer is the same physical thing. And of course, this move aims at accommodating the common intuition people have, and for sure scholars have, which is that the subjectivity of the mental does not feel well within an objective description of things, with the materialist view that ultimately everything there is out there is physical in its nature. So eventually materialism wins everything. Now, it is quite natural then for a type B materialist to try to make use of Saul Kripke's work on the necessary a posteriori truth. For since those truths are metaphysically necessary but not knowable a priori, a type B materialist will find a natural option to qualify this conditional physical truth hold only if qualia hold as being a necessary a posteriori truth, which parallels the necessary a posteriori truth water is H2O. The epistemic gap is there, for there is no a priori entailment from physical truth to qualia, but the counterpart ontological gap is absent. Type B materialism is vindicated by Kripke's work. Okay. Now, why Kripke believes that consciousness is an exceptional case, and this kind of maneuver that type B materialists are making just using Kripke's own methodology does not apply, nevertheless, when it comes to consciousness. So, quite rapidly, let me give you some arguments that Kripke gives against this kind of materialism and going along with a sort of Cartesian methodology. Now, toward the end of his classic book, Naming and Necessity, and also in his paper, Identity and Necessity, Saul Kripke observes that materialists have argued for some or even for all of the following statements. Persons are identical with their bodies. Sensations are identical with neural events. Types of sensations are identical with types of neural events. And Kripke devises a type of new Cartesian argument against each of those claims. Now, he stops short of endorsing the arguments. However, he clearly says that the arguments are valid and suggests that the premises are intuitively plausible. In addition to that, the modal considerations the arguments are built on are powerful and efficient not just against the above-mentioned identification, but also against type B materialism as such. Now, in the passages related to our issue, Kripke motivates two different modal arguments against the identification of a person with his or her body. Likewise, for the identification of sensations or type of sensations with neural events or types of neural events. if we focus upon the rejection of the first kind of identification, then the structure of argumentation is twofold. There is an argument based on the Cartesian concept of a disembodied mind, which goes like this. Kripke might have existed without his body, therefore Kripke is not identical to his own body. And there is another kind of argument which is similar to the arguments involving zombies. And here it is. Kripke's body might have existed without Kripke, let's say psychology or spirit, hence Kripke is not identical to Kripke's body. Now, Saul Kripke himself is crystal clear about the validity of those two arguments. And he says, and I quote from Kripke, "Now, the one response which I regard as plainly inadmissible is the response which cheerfully accepts the Cartesian premise while denying the Cartesian conclusion." How is that working? And let me just go very quickly over part of the argument which relates to Kripke's philosophy of language. Let the name Kripke be a rigid designator, which means that the name refers to Kripke himself not only at the actual world, but in each and every possible world. And let B, capital letter B, be a rigid designator for his body. Then, according to Kripke's model metaphysics and semantics, if Kripke were identical to his body, if Kripke were identical to B, then the supposed identity, being an identity expressed by a sentence in which two rigid designators occur, would be a necessary truth. And Kripke could not exist without his body, and his body B could not exist without Kripke. And Kripke himself rightly says, and I quote, and you have this on the slide, "A philosopher who wishes to refute the Cartesian conclusion must refute the Cartesian premise, and that latter task is not trivial at all." In another passage, we find, and I quote from Kripke, "All arguments against the identity theory which rely on the necessity of identity or on the notion of essential property are, of course, inspired by Descartes' argument for his dualism. The simplest Cartesian argument can be perhaps restated as follows. Let A be a name, rigid designator of Descartes' body. Then Descartes argues that since he could exist even if A did not, then it is possible that Descartes is not identical to his body. Therefore, indeed, at the actual world, Descartes is different, or it is not identical to his body. And those who have accused Descartes of a model fallacy, Kripke continues, have forgotten that the name A is rigid. So Descartes' argument is valid and his conclusion is correct, provided its perhaps dubitable premise is accepted. Okay, now we are faced with two options. Either the, let's say, scientifically inspired type B materialism, or else these kinds of arguments, which are the arguments of some very apt, very important philosophers who have been trained in science. Kripke was a mathematician in the beginning. David Chalmers is still, he's around, he's a rather young fellow, and he has been as a physicist. And when we are faced with this kind of clash of intuitions and arguments, we may take a look at what experimentalists are saying about this type of dialectics of the arguments. So let me just give you a short passage from this physicist, Henry Harris, who looked carefully into some of the arguments that I presented. And he has the following position. Okay. Now, I know quite well that most people, especially people coming from experimental science, usually react drastically to this kind of philosophical arguments involving fictional objects and very abstract notions and principles of logic and metaphysics. it is very legitimate then to ask ourselves what the relevance of this kind of analysis would be to so great a problem as the problem of the mind-body relation or the problem of consciousness. How much is it worth this armchair philosophizing about consciousness? Now, in this respect, it is very instructive to take a look at the attitude of an experimentalist towards this way of tackling the issue. And this gentleman, for instance, Harry Harris, in his paper called An Experimentalist Looks at Identity, says, and I quote, you have the quote on the slide, experimentalists who consider themselves to be working on the mind or on the brain find this argument laughable. But this is not due to any error in the formalization. So long as Saul Kripke stays within his formal system, which is modal logic by and large, the substitution of properties that he makes is unimpeachable. But when he substitutes elements of the real world, minds and brains, for X and Y's in his formal argument, the whole argument breaks down completely, Harry Harris says. What we have here is simply an example of an incompatibility with which every experimentalist is intimately familiar. The failure of a formal model to accommodate the complexity of reality. In formal systems, identity means no more than substitutivity within the system. But in the world of sticks and stones, additional or other criteria apply. However, what disturbs the experimental scientist more deeply than the inapplicability of Kripke's logic to the real world is this illusion that a question as complex and as intractable as the relationship between mind and brain could be disposed of by an exercise in formal logic. End of quote. Now, we may think, and I'm going to finish in 3 or 4 minutes to stick to the time frame. We may think that the competition was won over by physicalists and materialists, and that these kind of arguments that very apt, very intelligent, very wise logicians, philosophers are providing are not relevant to the real issues that we tackle here. But look at the map of the major theories of consciousness today. Because prima facie, if you say that, let's say, type B materialist is enough to understand consciousness and to go against Kripke's arguments, then it would be legitimate to entertain the idea that we already have a sort of paradigmatic account of consciousness. But if you look at the map, and I didn't actually list all the solutions to this problem, we have, for instance, global workspace theories, information-centric theories about consciousness, recurrent and predictive theories about consciousness, higher order and metacognitive theories about consciousness, embodied and inactive theories about consciousness, deflationary theories about consciousness. So at least 6 types of theories about consciousness, because within those types, each type there are very well-worked and minute theories. For instance, in global workspace and information-centric theories, we have global workspace theory, and then we have also integrated information theory. Within recurrent higher order and embodied theories, we have recurrent processing theories, predictive processing, active inference theories, higher order thought theories, inactive embodied cognition theories, and so on and so forth. And I could go on and on and on and give a lecture for 1 semester on that. Nevertheless, the problem is that all those theories are lacking some important links when we want to fully understand and explain what subjective experience depends upon and is made of. And just to end on this kind of more anecdotal note, let me give you this story, which is a real story, about 2 major figures in the field. This Australian philosopher, David Chalmers, who is actively working in the field of consciousness and mind, and this cognitive scientist, Koch, and they together put a wager in 1998. So David Chalmers and Christoph Koch, who is a neuroscientist, made this famous bet, which was that by 2023, so like 3 years ago, neuroscience would identify a neural signature both necessary and sufficient for conscious experience across different systems. And way back in 1998, they made this bet on a case of fine wine. And they said, look, in 25 years, if neuroscience is going to be able to identify whatever it takes in order to understand consciousness, then we, physicists, materialists, won the race. And if not, then philosophers having this kind of Cartesian and logical bending may be right about the fact that we need a new kind of science in order to globally understand human brain and human consciousness. And what happened in 2023 was that Koch accepted that we still don't have this kind of explanation. So neuroscience was not able in 25 years to give the whole signature, neuroscientific signature for the understanding of the consciousness. And he publicly accepted that David Chalmers won the wage, and very politely he handed in a case of fine wine to David Chalmers. But let's not jump to bad conclusion, to fallacious conclusion, because this does not mean neuroscience broadly failed. It only reflects that the stringent necessary and sufficient condition was not cleared. Research around, let's say, IIT or GNW and neural correlates still continues, and it is actually in the center of the stage of understanding consciousness today, in which both scientists coming from cognitive science and also philosophers and logicians are working together. So some conclusions. I would say that consciousness is still an open frontier, and the evidence strongly supports that recurrent processing and long-range integration matter for consciousness. PCI tracks levels of consciousness across sleep, anesthesia, and coma, yet deep questions remain open. IIT is conceptually rich but empirically contentious regarding phi estimation and predictions about simple systems. Higher order theories and metacognitive evidence links confidence and report to prefrontal areas, but whether this is constitutive or merely for access remains unresolved. And whether conceivability reliably guides us to metaphysical possibility, which is the crux of the conceivability argument, remains still the deepest unresolved question in the philosophy of mind. So I am going to leave you with this kind of open question on a rather, let's say, modest, optimistic conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. Any questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible that artificial intelligence can gain consciousness?
Could you speak to the mic, because I cannot hear all the words, sorry.
Do you think that it's possible that the artificial intelligence can gain consciousness?
No. As of yet, I am going to say bluntly no, because my view is that human intelligence, including consciousness, is strongly related to some lower levels aspects of our mind, such as emotions, okay, feelings, which are part of how mind works and which are also the resources for our conscious experience. And to the extent that AI does not feel emotions, does not have feelings, AI is not going to be conscious in the way in which we humans beings are conscious. Even though we might define another kind of consciousness, the kind of consciousness which pertains to AI, that is completely different from our own way of being conscious.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm an engineer, but all my life I've been struggling to make a difference between the brain and mind, and I'm an experimentalist. So can we go back to the example on Mary, seeing
Yes.
black and white?
Yeah.
Now, according to your explanation there, Mary has all the knowledge, all the reasoning to see black and white.
Yeah.
But she doesn't. She hasn't been exposed yet to red, and now,
Right.
and now, when that experiment takes place, to deal with that process, now we invoke consciousness. So I have a little problem there because now we have modalities in which we can excite the eye from outside and find the cones which are responsible for color in the retina.
Mhm.
So now till 20 years ago, there was only possible to send light and get electrical pulses. In the last 5 years, we can even get optical waves from the cones.
Mhm.
So we can experimentally demonstrate that the cone for red is there. So how do you deal with this case now?
Okay.
Is
Yeah,
that invoking consciousness or the fact that? But I leave you to explain.
That's very interesting, though. And let me tell you that Frank Jackson's mental experiment was devised some 40 years ago, at the time that they didn't have this kind of knowledge that we have now in engineering. But the question, as I see it, is the following. So Mary is confined in a room in which everything that she can see is white, black, and grayish. So she does not have, by the hypothesis of the thought experiment, the feeling of seeing red, the qualia of red. Okay? Now, by the conditions of the thought experiment, she knows everything that she can, in principle, know about colors from the textbooks in physics.
Okay.
So, still again, no experience of seeing red, only equations. And if you like, applied science, like cones and everything. Now, can she predict, can she infer her own subjective experience when she goes out in the real world and she sees for the first time a red rose? That's the question.
In one way, I would say yes, but in another way, I would say no, because this looks like an AI training process. Or she was exposed to black, to white, so she can see only the elements combining this. If you want red, that's not part from the training set. And because I put black and white and red on the same foot, that's my difficulty in making. Now, when I don't have a variable, the end of physicist in me finished, I have to leave philosopher to explain why red is not seen.
Yeah.
But I could see that.
You know, Frank Jackson says exactly what you say, in the sense that functionally, Mary has everything that she needs in order to experience red.
Correct.
So she doesn't lack anything, functionally speaking. But still, and this is the second part of your own answer, still, she does not have the feeling. She does not have the real subjective experience of seeing that.
No,
And I am trained, I was trained as a musician, classic musician. I played violin. And my own favored examples comes from music. So let's suppose that I know everything about acoustics, okay, about the frequencies of the sound and everything. And I didn't hear a musical instrument so far. Can I infer how that musical instrument is going to sound for my ears?
No, because that was not part of the training set.
no, but wait a second. I don't think it's just a question of training set, right? It's also a question of what's encoded, what possible states of consciousness are encoded in your biology, right? You don't have that experience. That's an external condition, right? There is something which is actually quite interesting. You know, I'm a material scientist, and in material science now, one of the interesting questions is how do you design materials that have the potential to do all sorts of things if somehow exposed to the right kind of external conditions. So now we know, and I think that this hasn't quite gotten into artificial intelligence, and probably it will never that will never happen. But these actual models of biological networks and neural networks and so on have extremely complicated landscapes. Extremely complicated landscapes equate to the fact that there is the potential of experiencing different minima or different states and an infinite number of, a huge number of states in these minima, and that are somehow encoded in our biology. The external forces kind of force you in one of these particular minima. For example, black and white, you have no experience of anything else. You have the potential to experience red, but maybe to experience red, you need an external force that pushes you into that experiential landscape, which is encoded in your biology. So this mind body in the context of materials, what you have is a design of a material that has many of these minima that you can actually move between with external forces. Now you might call that learning, but the point is the potential of learning is already encoded in your biology. So how that translates into philosophy, I don't know, but there is.
Yeah, I would say if I may rephrase that, and I fully agree with the point that you made, Professor Finkelstein. Deep down, there is a unity in the sense that we have the potentiality to know those things that we did not experience as of yet. But superficially, there's something which is new that we become aware, which is this kind of phenomenology that we did not experience before. So fundamentally, there is nothing new in our knowledge, but there is still something actually new, because you put the things in the terms that we are functionally able to see colors, but we did not see them yet, right? But we were physically capable of seeing the colors.
Right. So in this material analogy, what happens when you see color, or when you experience a new, let's say, minimum in this landscape, your entire landscape reorganizes, meaning your biochemistry, connects into, you have this sort of very complex. That's why the mind by itself and neural network by themselves are never going to create consciousness in a machine learning or an AI environment. There's no possible way that this dynamics and this infinite number of possibilities, infinite, exponential, in these models. And what's interesting in physics, you can actually calculate real things in these models, and they're kind of an exponential number of possible states. So I don't know, this seems completely consistent with, I'm not saying that we understand it, but there's kind of a phenomenology that could sort of describe the idea of consciousness that's a very dynamic and there is no static notion.
Yeah. I have some other arguments coming from the phenomenology of abstract objects. I don't know if you are aware of the positions that Kurt Gödel defended against this kind of physicalist conception about the world. And he said that mathematical creativity is something that we cannot account for in terms of this kind of physicalist outlook. I have a paper on that, but maybe that would be for another occasion, for another talk. So not only at the level of qualia, genuine qualia like sounds and colors and smells, but also at the level of abstract thinking. Some people like Gödel, for instance, believed that human mind creativity is something that cannot be replicated by machines.
In your example with music, do we need consciousness to explain pleasure?
Sure.
I feel pleasure. I don't feel the need to explain pleasure. I feel pleasure, and this is part of my awareness, of my consciousness. So, for instance, I feel the pleasure to engage with your arguments. Okay, this is a sort of intellectual pleasure. I don't feel the need to explain that. It's a basic fact about human consciousness and fundamental.
To me, that sounds very scientific. Anyhow, any other? Yeah. Sorry.
Thanks. Go ahead. You were
No, you were first.
it's not taking on a Saturday morning, but to me, it was like comparing apples.
Could you come closer to the mic, please? Because I cannot hear everything that you are saying.
It was not taking on a Saturday morning, but to me, it felt a little bit like comparing apples and oranges. So, on the one hand, knowing everything about color and so on. This is symbolism. This is what we do in physics. We abstract it, we make it reduction to symbolist language. And then we compare that to the sensory inputs of experiencing red. These are for me, two different physical things. And maybe this is me denying the ontological gap, as you described it, but I don't see the problem of being able to describe the sensory feeling of experiencing red in the same way that we describe, for example, the physics of what colors are. It's similar for the Kripke analogy. For example, when he says that I can think of separating mind from body, and therefore, because I can do that, I cannot refute that they are not related to each other. That's for me like in physics when we had the theory of the ether describing how light is propagating. It wasn't true. I mean, because experimentally we can show that another way of describing the thing is actually how light works. So just because I can think of something and that I cannot relate to experimental reality, it can never be an argument against something. This is what I had a problem with. But now I myself as an experimentalist as well.
Yeah, good points. The whole bargain with classic metaphysicians was to try to come up with a general abstract theory to explain everything. And this is huge. This is extremely maybe childish if we compare to what science is doing now, which is, of course, more conscious about the complexity of the world than maybe most metaphysicians are. But if you look at the logic of physicalism, this kind of metaphysical outlook, they really try to understand everything, including phenomenology, within the framework of physical objects. So actually they wanted to compare apples and oranges, you know? This was part of the game. And if we cannot do it, then that shows that there is a limitation to our own way of understanding in physical terms the reality. And maybe there's something more to say about experience in addition to what we say in quantitative terms, mathematical terms about reality.
Just maybe question. How do you, is it okay now? Yeah. About like the child who is born, okay? Usually see that the child will refer to itself in a third person.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about the development of the consciousness in the humans on one hand? Yeah. And on the other hand, I mean, also the level of the consciousness having this evolutionary scale of different organisms. I think that may give some other kind of light of what it means in these physical or emotional terms.
Yeah.
If you just comment on that, I mean, this is...
That's a very good point that you make, which puts the problem in a more practical and psychological context. Yes, this is indeed so. Children are taught to use some words that we then use in our adult lives in order to refer to our conscious experience. They are taught to use I instead of using their names on the third person, okay? He, she, or Mary, or John, or everything. What's interesting is that for children who are on the autistic spectrum, this is very difficult to teach them to use I instead of their own names. So this is part of the training for those children. So that shows, I mean, if we could actually know more about how neuroconvergent and neurodivergent children are working, maybe we are going to find out more about how human mind works in general. So even feelings and emotions, I would say, are learned by children, and this is part of another another dimension of what I'm thinking about this topic. And this is something which is different from AI, at least for now. We are part of a social and political ecosystem, and we are in the position to learn things from our parents, from our teachers, from the institutions. And there is a sort of extended mind and extended consciousness that we have, which relies on this kind of social network, of this kind of relationism. So I don't see something of that sort in AI, at least not now. But if in the future AI is going to be more political, more social, more cultural, more historical, then maybe we are going to face this kind of dilemma, whether or not AI is going to be like us. So a child cannot become a human being unless he's a part of a group, of a society. And you know how they say it takes a village in order to educate or to raise a child. I truly believe in that.
Just a short thing, because to connect with the materialistic kinds of the theories and so on, the child at the same time after the birth actually is developing physically the brain. Just like there are more cells, there are more connectivity and so on. And it looks like from observer part of the view that then they are gaining more and more. So it is the knowledge together with the physical development, anatomical development of the brain. That was another aspect which I was saying. I didn't maybe explain well.
Thank you.
One more question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So thanks for pointing us to Harry Harris. I would like to look at this, an experimentalist look at identity. Because by the time I did my physics in Polytechnica here, when I graduated a long time ago, from the first year of quantum mechanics, we understood in physics that anytime we try to measure something, we disturb the subject. So there are uncertainty equations, Heisenberg and so on. So that means that as long as I measure the outside world wonderful, I could collect data. But immediately as I try to measure myself, I should stop because I cannot obtain. Is such a view in this essay? Can I find it there?
Oh, yeah. Well, that for me raises the question of how accurate is the introspection. When we talk about consciousness, the stream of consciousness, the testimony that we have for ourselves is the fact that we feel that. If you ask me now, how do you know that your blood, your sugar in the blood has the N level, then I'm going to take a test. And I am going to say, well, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. But if you ask me, how do you know that you feel that you are hungry? That's nonsense. I can't have any sort of objective testimony to the fact that I feel that I'm hungry. You can point to the fact that the sugar in the blood is very low. Therefore, we have a causal explanation, a theoretical explanation. How come that Mircea Dumitru feels that he is hungry? And you would say, well, because the sugar has a low level. And that's a thing that I do not experience directly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay.
So the question then, and I'm going to finish with that, the question then is, to what extent introspection is a reliable source of knowledge about ourselves. And people working in memory, psychologists and neurophysiologists working in memory, point out that we are wrong almost all the time when we say, I recall that I did something 10 years ago, and then they show real proof. And we didn't do that, but we have the strong feelings that we did such a thing. So there might be this kind of discrepancy between this kind of phenomenology of ourselves, the knowledge at the first person, I would call it the I knowledge, as opposed to the objective knowledge at the third person. There is a gap between them, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mircea, very much. very stimulating.
I thank you very much. And I hope that helps you in person some other time.
I think we should have a workshop about glasses, biology, and philosophy, because it's
Right.
remarkable in these very complex systems that are only now beginning to be understood, how many of these kind of questions can actually be sort of rethought with real thought experiments. So reprogramming of stem cells, for example.
Good. Yeah. I accept your proposal. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a comment on this. 2 years ago, I organized a regeneration meeting in France and invited 5 philosophers. And in each of the sessions, there was one philosopher talking. It was a great success because everybody takes the game to think about what they're doing. It's really good. So I completely agree with you. So maybe organize one meeting like that.
Could you say it again for me, Professor Finkelstein, because I couldn't hear what the gentleman in the back said.
I just said that I told you. Yes, okay. I just said that I totally agree with what was said because 2 years ago I organized a meeting on regenerative biology, and we invited 5 philosophers that presented, intermingled with the presentations of the biologists, and everybody stayed in the room and discussed. And afterwards, in the pauses and the breaks, the discussion went on. So I really think that it's very important to have these kind of interdisciplinary that extend also our thought-provoking discussions. So I totally agree.
Romanian Academy is welcoming all of you to set up these kinds of meetings.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again.